Good afternoon, everyone. So now we are going to speak about our second project at the Center for Policy Research Land Rights Initiative, which has been an ongoing collaboration for the last 3 years with the Center on Law and Social Transformation in Bergen, with Professor Siri Glopin and my colleague Kavita Navlani Swarede, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the Center on Law and Social Transformation. And this project essentially has been an attempt to understand the political economy of land rights within the scheduled areas of India, within the sort of federal constitutional structure that we have. And it feels a bit surreal because, we had our startup conference launched in this very same room 3 years ago, and we are very happy, in fact, that many of our panelists then who have really helped us along the way are with us also today. So I want to thank them all for being a part of this journey over the last 3 years. So, what's this? Okay. So the way we've structured this panel is that we are going to make a presentation of our work on this project, and then we will have a panel to discuss the findings. So in this project, the central question that we've tried to answer is why, despite the existence of special constitutional and legal provisions for safeguarding the rights of tribals to land, and also special affirmative action provisions for the scheduled tribes, they continue to remain the most displaced, most vulnerable, and most impoverished of all groups in India. So first, I would like to speak briefly about the special differentiated legal regime and protections for the scheduled tribes in the scheduled areas. And then I will describe the dismal situation of the scheduled tribes, which, given these special protective provisions, warrants investigation. The scheduled tribes have both individual and group representation within the Indian federal constitutional framework. So, in other words, the legal regime governing the rights of the scheduled tribes is differentiated from the rest of the Indian population along several parameters. The first is that they have both individual and group representation within the Indian federal constitutional framework. There are separately reserved electoral constituencies in majority scheduled tribe districts for both the state assembly and parliamentary constituencies. In this, the other group with which there are similarities are the scheduled castes, who are also historically disadvantaged communities that have been given separate representation within the constitutional framework. But these are the only communities that have these kind of special protections, which are group representation as opposed to individual representation, which the rest of the population has. The second type of differentiated legal provision is that there are affirmative action provisions that reserve 7% of seats in government-funded educational institutions and government jobs for the tribals. And the reason why this is 7% is because it was their proportional percentage in the population at the time of independence. This number has, as I will mention later as well, gone up to 8.6% today. Here again, there are similarities with the scheduled castes, who also have similar affirmative action provisions, and they have about 15% reservations, again, which was proportional to their population at the time of independence. But the third thing which sort of differentiates the scheduled tribes, so thus far the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes are similar in terms of the protections that are available, but what differentiates the tribals from the scheduled castes at the level of the constitution, although there are similarities in some legal protections, but where the scheduled tribes are really distinct from the rest of the Indian population is that there are tribal majority areas carved out of the geographical landmass of India that are designated as the scheduled areas, which are scheduled areas because they are demarcated as the demarcated under what is known as the 5th and 6th schedules of the Constitution. Now, there is a plethora of literature on the scheduled tribes that have focused on their cultural identity, the historical injustices that have been perpetrated against them by the British colonial state, their poverty, vulnerability, displacement, and alienation from the Indian state. And there are many people in this room who know a lot about these issues. The reason why we decided to focus on land is because land, and especially forest land, is central to tribal identity, representation, and development. The scheduled tribes have been engaged in a variety of traditional occupations where they live off the land, especially forest land. But whether it is for some tribes hunting, gathering, collecting minor forest produce, shifting cultivation, and now increasingly settled cultivation, but they have a very special relationship with the land. which is integral to their identity, cultural and social and political life, and therefore displacement from the land makes them not only economically vulnerable, it threatens to destroy their cultural identity as a tribal group. And I just want to mention here, because even in the land acquisition report, as we very clearly sort of say in the very beginning, that land is not just an economic resource, but it affects many aspects of economic, social, and political life, and therefore contestation around land is therefore not just about economic benefits, it's about social and political contestation. So I think that's a stand that we've consistently sort of taken, but I think especially with respect to the tribals, because of their integral relationship to the land, it is even more threatening. So let me first outline the constitutional framework that governs the scheduled areas and consequently the rights of the scheduled tribes. I mentioned the 5th and 6th schedules read with Article 244(1) of the Constitution, which actually demarcate these areas and subject them to a different legal and administrative regime. The scheduled tribes are also designated in the are designated in the Constitutional Scheduled Tribes Order of 1950. The order currently lists 744 tribes across 22 states in its first schedule. Numerous additions and deletions have been made to this list based on information that has been provided by the state governments over the last 66 years. The 5th schedule provides for the administration of tribal majority areas in 9 states within peninsular India that have tribal minority populations. That is, the population of the scheduled tribes is in a minority as compared to the population of the remainder of the state. The President of India can by order declare any area to be a scheduled area. So the currently designated scheduled areas are in the states of Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Gujarat, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Himachal Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Orissa, and Rajasthan. And the states that are highlighted in red are actually the states that we have looked at for the purposes of this project in more detail. But this is the sort of representation of the scheduled areas on the map, which is the orange areas. These are all states that have scheduled areas. And, it's interesting because as Gopal mentioned in the morning, as lawyers, we don't learn anything about this aspect of the Constitution or about the legal framework governing these issues. So according to the 5th schedule, these areas have to be administered by the governor of the state in consultation with the tribes' advisory councils that are to be appointed by the governor. The governor has powers to regulate the application of state laws and acts of parliament to the scheduled areas. So he can also make additional regulations for the good governance of any or all scheduled areas in a state. Now, India is often described as a union of states. What that means is, of course, that we have a federal system but with a unitary bias. And we have a parliamentary system of government, which means that the president and the governors make their decisions mostly on the basis of the recommendations of the Council of Ministers. So the implication for that, the implication of this for how 5th schedule areas are governed is that there is a considerable centralization of power. What this also means is that legally speaking, there is no recognition of tribal sovereignty over the land and natural resources in the scheduled areas. The Indian state does claim sovereignty over these areas, and there is only recognition that there is a special status of the tribals and that there are state-directed laws for their protection. Now, here, I'm not saying that this is a morally right or normatively good proposition. I'm just describing the state's relationship to the scheduled areas as they understand it within the constitutional framework. Despite the governor's extensive powers in these areas over the last 65 years, they have been rarely exercised. And actually, when we started working on this project is when we realized that, again, like with the land acquisition study, there is just not enough data on this. So, for instance, even to look at governor's reports, because it took a long time for us to actually access them, but, we have been able to access them through right to information requests from various states. But it's even like even the government itself doesn't seem to necessarily have all the governor's reports for all the years, even though the governor is required to submit a report every year. So we managed to get about 10 reports over the years from different states. But, this project has been challenging because of the fact that much of the data has been lacking on many issues for us to understand some of these things. So, but with the enactment of the sorry, can we go back to with the enactment of the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, there has been greater devolution of political power to the Gram or village panchayats which are within the 5th schedule areas. the fifth scheduled states have also enacted laws that prohibit the transfer of land within the tribal areas from the scheduled tribes to non-tribals. So there is a constitutional legal framework, and then there's a constitutional framework, constitutional protections, and there are legal protections that states have also made. Now, if you look at the sixth schedule. So, sixth schedule applies to the administration of tribal areas in the northeastern states of Assam, Meghalaya, Mizoram, and Tripura. If we can just go back on the map, then those were the blue states in the northeast. It provides for a system of scheduled areas called autonomous districts and autonomous regions within the districts to be administered democratically by the indigenous tribal population of these states. So, in this particular project, for the fifth schedule states, we are looking at the states of Gujarat, Andhra Pradesh, and Telangana. For the sixth schedule, we are looking at the state of Meghalaya. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the tribal population in India is spread across 22 states, and yet the designated scheduled areas are to be found in only 16 states. So we know that there are many states with tribal populations that do not have designated scheduled areas for the same. Even within the states that do have designated scheduled areas, significant tribal population may be found in the areas that are not scheduled areas. Moreover, there is considerable variation both in terms of the percentage of tribal population with respect to the population of the tribal minority states. So, fifth scheduled states are tribal minority states where certain tribal majority areas have been carved out, and sixth scheduled states like Meghalaya, for instance, the whole state is a scheduled area, and about 86% of the population is actually scheduled tribes. So, these are tribal majority states, but within the tribal minority states, there are huge variations in the percentage of tribal population to the total population of the state. When we started looking into this, there's been a lot of government reports on the scheduled tribes and scholarly literature as well, but they have focused, in terms of the data that we could look at, have focused on the scheduled tribe population and not on the scheduled areas under the constitution. For instance, when we realized at some point that there was simply no statistical data on how much geographical area in India is within the scheduled area. And so we began to collect primary data from the census at the district, tehsil, taluk, and village level to create data on scheduled areas and scheduled tribe population. And Ankit, do you want to speak about the methodology we used?
So basically the idea was to, we had the data with respect to the scheduled tribes in terms of their development and the other indices, but in terms of what is happening to the population which is living in scheduled areas. So that is what we wanted to create. So first of all, we relied on the annual reports of the Ministry of Tribal Affairs to find out which are the scheduled areas, demarcated areas, and cross-check them. And then the second thing was to map these areas which are demarcated as per the different notifications with the latest census 2011 database. So there was key challenges that we faced at this time because most of the demarcated regions have shifted over that time, not geographically, but in terms of their so for example, like in case of Andhra Pradesh, if we see, and Telangana, if we see, the notifications are at the level of the villages. The different villages are notified to be the scheduled areas. And when we are trying to map these villages with the census 2011 database, we are not able to find approximately 50% of the villages. It has happened because the villages have merged with each other. They have gone to different districts, and in some cases even to different states. And this kind of information has not been updated on the website or any other portal of the government of India. So that was first of the major challenge, to map the areas with the latest database to get some sense about the different development indicators. But we were able to do a lot of work for most of the states where the demarcation was at the level of the districts, because that information was straightforward. But one caveat was that over the time the districts have changed. I mean, the districts have been divided or they have also been merged. So we have taken care of that thing again. So in terms of analysis, we have produced the data at the level of state, what is happening at the level of state, the states which have scheduled areas, and also the data at the level of the districts which have the scheduled area within them. We have analyzed data based on what is the total area, which is the scheduled area at the level of district, what is the population that is residing within the scheduled area at the district level, and the ST population that is residing in scheduled areas, to get a sense of how many people have moved out of the scheduled area, given the protective framework they already have. And in the end, we have visually represented this information using GIS software. Apart from this, we have also done some work for the political constituencies to see the representation of the scheduled tribes, and we were trying to map which are the scheduled areas and which are the reserved political constituencies, and trying to see what is the overlap between them. But again, as some of you may know that the political constituencies are marked very differently as how the administrative districts are marked. So again, we needed to do a lot of mapping to make these two different databases coherent and to do the mapping which can be compared with each other. We will be presenting those graphs later in the presentation.
So based on all this data collection exercise, which took, as you can imagine, several months, we now can tell you that about 10.5% of India's geographical area is scheduled areas. This is a statistic that we've created which didn't exist before, but it's really a staggering amount of land, actually, when you think about it, and the fact that we don't really know much about. So most of this, a little over 9%, is fifth schedule area, and about 1.38% is in the northeast, which is under the sixth, which is designated as sixth schedule area on the map. Now when we look at the total population of the scheduled areas as percentage to total population of India, so fifth schedule areas have 6.7% of of the total population of India. So they are more sparsely populated as compared to the rest of the country. The sixth schedule areas have about 0.5%. So in total, the total population of the schedule areas is 7.2%. But this is not just tribal population. This number actually, the number of people who are living here are both scheduled tribes and people who have, started living in these areas who are non-tribals. So when we look actually at the scheduled tribe population of scheduled areas as percentage to scheduled tribe population of India, only 28.2% of tribals are actually living within the demarcated scheduled areas. So if you add the two sets of populations together, we find that of the total tribal population, only 30% is actually within the scheduled areas. Even though these are tribal majority areas, actually tribals are statistically in a minority in these areas. So this map actually shows the percentage of scheduled area as percentage of the geographical area of the state. So the purple state, which is Meghalaya, which the whole state is the scheduled area, is actually, it's 100%. So it's the only one that's more than 90%. But you can see that there is a spectrum here with, the states that are in yellow, they have less than 10% of so states like Maharashtra and Rajasthan have less than 10% of the geographical area scheduled area. But then states like Andhra Pradesh and Telangana in orange and also Gujarat, they do have between 10 to 25% of their land as scheduled area, and states like Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh as well. So Chhattisgarh has between 25 to 50% of its area as scheduled area, and then Jharkhand has over a majority of the land as scheduled area. Now, this is again a district-wise representation of fifth and sixth schedule area districts in India, and in terms of districts as percentage of total district geographical area, the purple ones are the ones where entire districts are scheduled areas, and the other places, a smaller percentage of the district is actually designated as a scheduled area, because as Ankit explained, some of the designation is at the district level. Andhra Pradesh, Telangana are particularly difficult. In fact, we spend more time on Andhra Pradesh and Telangana than on any other state, and we've still not finished figuring this out. It has been incredibly difficult. So the scheduled tribes, as I mentioned, are some of the most vulnerable groups in India. They have statistically borne disproportionately the burden of economic development in India, because if you look at the figures, the poverty and landlessness is rampant amongst the scheduled tribes. More than half of all scheduled tribes are below the poverty line. 65% of the scheduled tribes are landless as per the 2011 census. And this number is not only high compared to 40.2% for the national average, but also what is more significant is that that this number is also growing in recent decades. So even though the scheduled tribes constitute only 8.6%, so there were 7% at the time of independence, today they are 8.6% of the total population, so the population is growing. They constitute 55% of the people who have been displaced since independence due to the construction of dams, mines, industrial development, and the creation of wildlife parks and sanctuaries. So it is clear that they have disproportionately borne the burden of economic development, and it is interesting that even though these are the major causes of displacement, in the land acquisition study, as I mentioned, the litigation on dams, mining, and irrigation is about 5% of the Supreme Court litigation because of the inability to bring claims and other reasons that have been deliberated upon in the last two panels. So what's going on here? We have actually a protective constitutional framework, and even as we bemoan the fact that the condition of the scheduled tribes is really dismal, when we compare the conditions of indigenous populations in other parts of the world, it is actually pretty striking that, India had these provisions entrenched within the constitution as early as 1950, because in many, many countries, recognition of rights of indigenous rights has happened at a much later stage in time. Countries like Australia still don't have the same kinds of protections that we have. So we did have some progressive provisions within the constitution. We have enacted some progressive laws now, but what's really going on here, and how can we understand these issues better? So we started investigating these questions based on the comparative study of the 4 Indian states that were chosen based on their. Can we keep to the other slide? Previous slide. Yeah, chosen based on their geographical population and constitutional diversity, and also where we had resource persons on the ground. Many of them are in this room. But of course, as we know, that Andhra Pradesh was bifurcated into Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. And so then we decided to sort of look at both the states. And we selected these states because they do show variation with regard to the numbers and concentration of tribal population, levels of social and economic development, socio-political differences, and current and historical federal dynamics. AP, as I mentioned, is also unusual because unlike the other states where almost entire districts or large parts of districts are designated as scheduled areas, in AP we have very small points of study composed of some villages within districts scattered across the state that are classified as scheduled areas. So we have some preliminary findings that we would like to share with you. So this is just a representation of the scheduled area districts in Gujarat. As you can see that they are all along the eastern side of the state, and these the blue districts show the ones which where more than 90% of the district is actually classified as a scheduled area district. Can I have some water? And what's the next map? And this is for Telangana and for Andhra Pradesh. These are the scheduled area districts. Next map. Yeah. So in terms, as I was mentioning, these states were chosen because of variations in the percentages of tribal population and other factors. So if you look at the scheduled tribe population to total state population, as I mentioned, 8.6% of India's population is tribal. In Gujarat, it's almost 15% of Gujarat has tribal population. Andhra Pradesh, so earlier for combined Andhra Pradesh it was about 7%. Now it's actually Andhra Pradesh has 5.3%, Telangana has 7.7%, and Meghalaya has 86.1%. It was at this stage of the project that we realized that it would also have, in order to sort of see the spectrum along the issues of states which have certain percentages of geographical area and tribal population. It would have also, if we go back to our map, it have been interesting to study one of either Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand, because they have, for instance, Jharkhand has more than a majority. So in the spectrum of geographical area and tribal area, Meghalaya is on one extreme, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, or the other, Gujarat is somewhere in the middle, and Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, one of them would also have been there, and which is why in the panel we will have discussions on one of the states. Yeah. Now, this is just a quick sort of picture of the things that I mentioned, the variations in terms of economic growth vis-a-vis the tribal population of these states. So you know that Gujarat has 15% tribal population. Its average GDP growth is about 9.3% for the last decade. And it's interesting that even though, and these are for both Andhra Pradesh and Telangana as well, but also Meghalaya, they are all states with high economic growth in terms of growth percentages compared to the national average. The per capita GDP ranking, of course, varies between the states, and the human development ranking, as you can see, economic freedom does not really translate to human development rankings as well, because both Gujarat and Andhra Pradesh rank very high on economic freedom indices, but they are only middling in terms of human development indicators. But just to give you a sort of picture of the socioeconomic profile of these states. So, based on all the work that we have done, what we have realized is that, I mean, if these are a few preliminary observations that we would like to share, because as I said, this project is ongoing. But essentially, based on the data we collected in terms of identifying the scheduled area districts, based on the information we've got from the governor's reports that we've been able to access, what the story that sort of comes out is that, and it sort of came out in the previous two panels as well, that India is a constitutional administrative state. In other words, we have a very, in some ways, a very progressive constitution which guarantees a lot of rights, but there is enough, there is so much is dependent upon the administrative framework to effectuate that into reality. So, for instance, you know, even though it's the constitution which actually demarcates that these states should have these scheduled areas, the ability to change districts and villages, and you know, that is very much something that lies with the particular administrative ministry that has the power to do this. So this is a constitutional right which is there, but if that area can be tweaked and changed and districts can be renamed, and we've also seen this in the context of the bifurcation of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, then it is very hard to say what these protections really mean. So the first sort of preliminary observation is that the protective provisions contain, because and this observation is sort of directly responding to a lot of the discourse that I experienced within the academic discourse, but also in other, that there was a lot of emphasis on the constitution. There was a lot of emphasis when we began this conversation that, you know, the fifth schedule provisions were not so progressive, sixth schedule was more progressive. We need to amend the constitution. We need to bring the sixth schedule provisions to the fifth schedule. But I think that what has really come out through our study and of looking at these states together is that the protective provisions contained in the fifth and sixth schedules do not exist in a vacuum and have to be seen against the backdrop of a series of contrary laws as well as administrative framework and practices that are there. So if I can just, no, just stay at the same, yeah. So this point also sort of comes out from my doctoral work, which traces the law of eminent domain from the colonial period until about 1970, and it examines how state institutions in India, first the British colonial state, but later within the independent Indian state, the parliament, the executive, and the Supreme Court have reshaped property relations in land in India. And of course, the stated motivations of the colonial state and that of the independent Indian state are different. The colonial state's motivation was to maximize revenue for the British crown. And, you know, a lot of the laws that have actually displaced tribals of the years are relics of the colonial era, whether it's the Land Acquisition Act or the forest laws or the mining laws and so on. But even though the stated motivation of the Indian state has been actually to redistribute property relations for the purposes of economic development and social justice, you know, there has been a lot of cynicism about the Indian state, but I think what even our land acquisition data has shown that much of the acquisitions that have been litigated have actually been for progressive purposes like affordable housing or planned development. But even if the stated motivations may be progressive, the existence of significant institutional and legal continuities between the British colonial state and the independent Indian state have meant that despite these different motivations, the consequences of their policies for the interests of tribals and traditional communities have been quite similar. Therefore, the provisions in the fifth and sixth schedules have to be seen against the backdrop of the broader framework of law and governance within which they operate. And I mean, this is also a point that we made in the land acquisition report, is that legal reform is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for actually ensuring progress. We have to reform administrative practices and institutional practices. To give you an example on this, and what that then means is that that the discourse has to sort of, I think, be both macro and micro, in the sense that we need to understand and look at the state's active role in displacing tribals from their land through various laws of land acquisition for building dams, infrastructure, protecting forest land, and mining. We have to look at all of these laws at the level of the legal framework that they operate, but we also have to look at what laws are more responsible for what kinds of displacement in particular states. So to give you an example, if you look at dams as the source of displacement, which have been a big source, if you look at this map about the concentration of dams in India, we see a significant concentration of dams in Gujarat. And if you look at the second map, which is actually which indicates a major dam, or a dam of natural. So there are major dams which are large dams, and then there are dams that are of national importance. And we find that in Gujarat, in the scheduled, all these dams are concentrated within the scheduled areas. We have as many as 78 to 100 dams. And in fact, all 3 dams of national importance in Gujarat are based in the scheduled areas. So we know that displacement because of dams is bound to be a much more serious issue in Gujarat as compared to the other states, and we don't have the maps here, but it's definitely a huge issue for Gujarat as compared to AP Telangana, although that may change with Polavaram, and we're going to have some of those discussions. But we know that dams are a big part of the story in Gujarat. Similarly, in terms of forest cover, we see this map which shows a considerable overlap between the scheduled areas and the forest cover in India. Now, as we know, through these 19th century laws, the British basically, through one stroke of the pen, asserted ownership of all forest land in India and outlawed the people living in the forests. So the fact that only 30% of the tribals are living within scheduled areas where there is a considerable overlap with forest cover has been a consequence of a 150-year policy on part of the colonial state to systematically evict tribals from the forests. And now, even though this century of historical injustice has been attempted to be reversed by the PESA Act of 1996 and the Forest Rights Act of 2006, we find that this legal reform, again, the point about institutional and administrative practices and continuities being there, and also the point that was made that, the Forest Rights Act is also being used by the more powerful people to actually secure their rights to the land. But it's interesting to also look at that. I mean, we don't have that map here on mining. We don't have the map here, but most of the mineral wealth in India is also concentrated within land that comes within forest land, where there is also overlap with the scheduled areas, and we find both legal and illegal eviction of the tribals in these states by government and private corporations to extract mineral resources. And there is a vast framework of laws relating to mining which expropriate these resources, as Kanchi was also mentioning in the morning. But again, I think what we are trying to do with this study, and we've only gotten thus far, is to actually figure out, okay, which states is mining an issue in terms of within the schedule, like really actually sort of geographically figuring out where mining is a big issue, and what kind of displacement is it occasioning. And finally, we have another. So this map shows the overlap between the scheduled areas and Naxalism, and there is not a complete overlap, but there is a considerable overlap between the areas, and we know this. We know this anecdotally, but the idea that here is to sort of generate systematic data to understand this kind of overlap as well. So if you put all of this together with the legal framework and the constitutional framework that I was mentioning earlier, when we think of the Constituent Assembly debates on the drafting of the 5th and 6th schedules, which gave these special constitutional protections, we think of them in terms of 3 intersecting narratives of development, representation, and rights to land. And that was the first thing that I started off with, that the scheduled tribes have a special status because they have special group representation, and they are recognized as communities within the debates who have to be given this special status because they have been in some ways, unlike the scheduled castes, where the narrative is one of historical discrimination. With respect to the scheduled tribes, the narrative is one of development. That they are tribes that are more vulnerable because they are seen as not, it's not seen as developed economically and socially as the mainstream. And of course, we can have many views about whether that's a correct narrative or not, but that was definitely in the narrative in the Constituent Assembly debates. So. But the problem with that narrative is that the scheduled tribes, unlike the scheduled castes who have been a part, in some ways have been a part of the mainstream of society, though historically discriminated against, the scheduled tribes have always been out of the mainstream of Indian society, and there are many, and many of these tribes are keen to protect their identity as being the mainstream of Indian society. So that makes the situation more difficult in terms of how they relate to the mainstream. In terms of their representation, the representation narrative, the scheduled tribes are represented through a group identity within the constitutional framework, which is different from that of the rest of the population. They are represented as a group within the tribes' advisory councils as part of the federal structure. They also have affirmative action reservations as a group. And there again, we find that here that they have a different form of representation as compared to individual representation, which is a dominant mainstream. And as I mentioned, we're still analyzing the data on political constituencies, but because there isn't a complete overlap between the constituencies that are reserved for tribals and the areas which are tribal dominant, therefore, again, within the representation framework, even though it is created to sort of provide them adequate representation, actually fails in providing them adequate representation. And the final narrative is that of their relationship to land. They have both individual and community rights to land, which has been recognized also now through the Forest Rights Act in the forest areas. But as Usha also mentioned, not all scheduled areas are forest areas. So what happens there and what doesn't happen there? So again, what this means is that, again, with respect to the dominant mainstream, which has individual rights to land, they're again pitted outside of the dominant mainstream, and therefore the dominant articulation of property rights in terms of individual rights within the areas that they're living in has actually led to their displacement, because because of the recognition by the state of individual rights over community rights, that's there, but also within the tribal understanding of ownership is different. So they have not been able to assert their rights in the same way, because within their own mindset, the idea of individual ownership is the idea of, and of course there are huge variations. There are 722 tribals, but there is definitely this concept, this idea of community identity and community property, which is there, and it's a dominant idea there. So in terms of all these three narratives, whether it's development, whether it's representation, or whether it's the relationship to land, they are pitted against the mainstream. And this is one reason why they have continued to be marginalized and disadvantaged, because their very identity and existence is opposed to the dominant mainstream on these fundamental narratives. And again, the third point that has come out within our fieldwork is that there is considerable variation amongst tribal groups, both between different states in peninsular India, but also within states. And for instance, in Andhra Pradesh, there are 33 recognized tribal groups, of which 8 are particularly vulnerable tribal groups. And when we were doing fieldwork in the state, what we understood is that a lot of the displacement of tribals is also because of displacement by dominant tribal groups of tribal groups that are not so dominant. So this is not a unified tribal, there is no unified tribal identity. In fact, sometimes the rancor between tribal groups is so significant that actually, we've spoken to people who have told us that it's very hard, in fact, to get all the tribal communities together to dialogue on various issues. Similarly, there are 29 notified scheduled tribes in Gujarat, but 47% of the tribal population, that is almost half, is only one tribal group. So that's the third sort of point that comes out, which prevents them from articulating their claims as effectively as they might have been able to if there was a more unified identity. And then, of course, there are the problems of over-inclusion and under-inclusion. There are some tribal groups that are recognized as a scheduled tribe. For instance, the Lambadas, which are recognized as a scheduled tribe in Andhra Pradesh, but they're recognized as an OBC in bordering Maharashtra. And what has happened is there has been, because of the benefits extended to the scheduled tribes, there has been significant migration of this group from Maharashtra to Andhra Pradesh. And finally, we find that there are significant variations in implementation of the fifth schedule across states, which came out through our key informant interviews, and also the normative legal framework at the state level, which supports the protective provisions. So both at the level of the laws that support the constitutional protections, but also at the level of administration, we find variations between states. And finally, we find it is impossible to understand legal change. So we've understood. So law can only go so far, because on the three narratives on which the law is based, there is the tribals are marginalized against the mainstream. The law can also only go so far, because the administrative institutional continuities between the colonial state and the independent Indian state make it very difficult for law to go farther. But law is also, it costs money to make legal reform effective. And if you look at the financial allocations that have been made for tribal welfare and development of the scheduled areas, we find them to be very small compared to the total percentage of the tribal population and their needs. So there is a need also for increasing spending on many of these issues to effectuate this legal reform, which is not which is insufficient. Ankit, you want to speak further?
So we are trying to understand like what is the mechanism of financing the development of the tribals. So what we have understood, as it is a work in progress and we are still in the process of collecting the data and putting it systematically so that we can do a comparative analysis between different states what is happening. So overall there is Ministry of Tribal Affairs which gets its funds from the union budget, and through different provisions it runs 9 central sector schemes, 2 centrally sponsored schemes and 2 special area programs to fund the development of the tribals in different states. Now these schemes and different programs have a different conditionalities upon which they can disburse or use the funds. And once these, so just to understand it simply, so there is a concept of tribal sub-plan under which the different ministries, apart from doing their jobs, they also contribute some amount of the funds for the tribal development. Those funds are consolidated and passed on to the state governments as the central TSP, upon which they also get some funds from the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, and then the state governments put out some funds from its own budgets, and there can be some special programs run by the state governments, for example in Gujarat. And this becomes the total kitty that the state government has to spend for the development of the tribals. Now these funds can be spent for the development of the tribals in the scheduled areas and also for the development of the tribals who have migrated out of the scheduled areas. And as the data is showing that currently the 30% overall, the total tribals are only living in scheduled areas. We want to understand that what is the division or what is the expenditure mode in which these kind of funds are being used by the different state governments. Are they being targeted properly or not? But still it is a work in progress, so we don't have the entire data, but we'll put it out. But one interesting thing to find out is, given the 14th Finance Commission and its recommendation that more of the funds are being devolved to the state governments. Now it will be interesting to see how the different state governments are approaching this development program in terms of the devolution of the funds from their own kitties. Yes.
And the last point apart from the cost of implementing legal reform is about, again, about the active subversion of the rule of law by the administrative apparatus. So the Forest Department, which for the last 150 years has been controlling forest land and also has been responsible for evicting tribals from the land. Now, under the Forest Rights Act, the nodal agency for implementation of the Forest Rights Act is the Tribal Welfare Department. But the Tribal Welfare, because it's the Forest Department that actually has a bureaucratic structure to understand these areas, and the Tribal Welfare Department has to work with the Forest Department to get anything done. We find that the Forest Department lack of cooperation, to put it mildly. We find active subversion of the work that even the Tribal Welfare Ministry has to do. So I think I will end with that. I think the main takeaway is essentially in continuation with what we've said before in land acquisition stuff, is that unless we have first more data to really understand what's going on, and secondly serious administrative and institutional reform to actually ensure more compliance with the rule of law as outlined in the Constitution, but also within the legal framework, but also in many instances, which as has also come out in previous panels, we need a change in mindset of the bureaucracy in the way, and it's not going to be easy, because at the end of the day, this is, if you look at the Forest Department, they've acted in a particular way for 150 years. So that change, will take time, even if there is a commitment to it. But currently, we are in a situation where perhaps there isn't enough commitment to it, and I think that's what we need to address, as well as legal change. So legal change is obviously necessary, and it is great that it happens in a progressive way, but it is not sufficient to bring about the changes we want.